The grand hall of Whitmore Manor smelled of fresh roses and burning candle wax. Servants moved quietly between long tables, their trays balanced with practiced ease, while musicians tuned their instruments in the corner. Tonight was no ordinary evening. Tonight, the entire kingdom believed, would mark the beginning of a new era for the Whitmore family. Duke Alexander Whitmore stood near the tall windows, dressed in a deep navy coat with silver buttons that caught the candlelight whenever he moved. He looked every bit the man his title demanded, composed, polished, and distant. But anyone who knew him well could see the tightness in his jaw and the way his eyes kept drifting toward the door, as if searching for an escape that did not exist. His mother, the Duchess Margaret, stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore an expression of quiet triumph, the kind of look a woman wears when years of careful planning are finally about to bear fruit. "Princess Seraphina will arrive within the hour," she said, her voice low but firm. "Tonight, you will make your intentions known, Alexander. The kingdom has waited long enough." Alexander said nothing. He simply nodded, the way he always did when arguing felt pointless. The marriage between Duke Alexander and Princess Seraphina had been discussed for nearly 3 years. Their families ruled neighboring lands that had once been bitter rivals, divided by a long and painful history of border disputes. A union between the two houses would end decades of tension and open trade routes that had been closed for a generation. It was, by every measure that mattered to the kingdom, a perfect match. Everyone agreed it made sense. Everyone, it seemed, except Alexander. He had met Seraphina only twice before tonight, both times in formal settings surrounded by advisors and attendants. She was intelligent and graceful, with a sharp wit that occasionally slipped past her royal training. He did not dislike her, but he did not know her either, and the thought of spending his entire life beside a woman he barely understood left a quiet ache in his chest that he could not explain to anyone, least of all his mother. As the guests began to fill the hall, Alexander excused himself and walked toward the kitchen corridor, a place no duke was expected to wander. He told himself he simply needed a moment of quiet before the chaos began. The truth was something he had not yet admitted to himself. The corridor was narrower than the grand hall, lit by simple lanterns instead of crystal chandeliers. Here, the air smelled of warm bread and brewing tea instead of perfume. Alexander slowed his steps, enjoying the rare silence, when he heard a voice humming softly from behind a half-open door. He paused and looked inside. A young woman stood at a wooden table, arranging delicate teacups onto a silver tray. Her dark hair was pulled back into a simple braid, and her sleeves were rolled to her elbows as she worked. She hummed an old folk tune under her breath, completely unaware that anyone was watching her. "You sing while you work," Alexander said, before he could stop himself. The woman startled, nearly dropping the cup in her hand. She turned quickly, her eyes widening when she realized who stood in the doorway. She set the cup down and lowered into a quick, careful curtsy. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not realize anyone was nearby." "There is nothing to forgive," Alexander said, stepping into the room. "I rather enjoyed it." The woman straightened, though her cheeks had turned a soft shade of pink. "I am Eliza, Your Grace. I work in the kitchens and serve at gatherings such as tonight's." "Eliza," Alexander repeated, as though testing the sound of her name. "And do you always hum while preparing tea, Eliza?" "Only when I believe no one important is listening," she said, then immediately pressed her lips together, as if regretting the boldness of her own words. To her surprise, the Duke laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "Then I suppose I should apologize for intruding," he said, "though I confess, It was the first real laugh I have had all week. Eliza studied him for a moment, unsure whether such familiar conversation was appropriate between a duke and a servant, but there was something in his eyes, a tiredness that had nothing to do with the late hour, which made her soften. "If I may say so, Your Grace, you look like a man who would rather be anywhere else tonight." Alexander considered lying, offering some polished response about duty and honor. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who has spent years pouring tea for people pretending to be happy, Eliza said with a small smile. Before Alexander could respond, a sharp voice called from down the hall. "Eliza, the princess has arrived. The trays are needed in the main hall immediately." Eliza picked up her tray at once, the easy conversation between them dissolving into formality. "I must go, Your Grace." "Of course," Alexander said, stepping aside to let her pass. As she walked by, their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them, though neither could have named it. The rest of the evening unfolded exactly as planned. Princess Serafina arrived in a gown of pale gold, her presence commanding immediate attention from every corner of the hall. She greeted Alexander with practiced warmth, and the two exchanged polite conversation under the watchful eyes of both their families. Yet throughout the evening, Alexander's gaze kept drifting toward the servants moving quietly along the edges of the room, searching for a particular dark braid among them. Each time he caught sight of Eliza pouring tea or refilling glasses, he found himself unable to look away for long, though he forced his attention back to Serafina whenever his mother's eyes found him across the room. In the days that followed, Princess Serafina extended her stay at Whitmore Manor, as was customary before a formal engagement. The household buzzed with preparation, and the Duchess began discussing wedding details with an enthusiasm that left no room for Alexander's hesitation. Yet Alexander found himself drawn, again and again, to the quiet corners of the estate, where he might cross paths with Eliza. He told himself each encounter was simple coincidence, a walk through the garden that happened to pass the kitchen entrance, or an evening stroll that led him near the servants' quarters. But deep down, he knew he was no longer pretending these meetings were accidental. One afternoon, he found Eliza in the garden, gathering herbs for the kitchen. She knelt beside a row of rosemary bushes, her basket half full. "You seem to wander far from the kitchen for someone with so many duties," Alexander said, approaching slowly. Eliza looked up, unsurprised by his presence this time. "The head cook sends me for fresh herbs when the garden ones are needed. And you, Your Grace, seem to wander far from your princess for someone with so many duties of his own." Alexander chuckled, settling onto a nearby stone bench. "You speak rather boldly for someone serving a duke." "You have not silenced me yet," Eliza replied, returning to her work. "I take that as permission to continue." They spoke for nearly an hour that day, about nothing of great importance and yet, somehow, about everything that mattered. Eliza told him of her father, once a respected merchant whose business had collapsed after a series of failed trade deals, leaving the family with nothing but debt and shame. She spoke of her mother's illness, and how she had taken work at the manor to support them both. There was no bitterness in her voice, only quiet determination. Alexander, in turn, spoke of pressures Eliza had never imagined a duke might carry, the weight of expectations placed on him since childhood, the endless lessons in politics and diplomacy that left little room for simple joy, the marriage arranged before he had ever been given a chance to choose for himself. "It must be strange," Eliza said thoughtfully, "to have everything and still feel as though none of it is truly yours." Alexander looked at her, struck by how easily she understood something his closest advisors never seemed to grasp. "You understand more than most people in that hall ever will," he said quietly. From that day forward, their conversations became a quiet routine, hidden from the eyes of the court. They met in the garden during early mornings, in the library during rare quiet evenings, and occasionally in the kitchen corridor where it had all begun. Each meeting deepened a connection neither of them had expected nor fully understood. Meanwhile, preparations for the engagement announcement continued. The Duchess grew impatient with what she perceived as Alexander's reluctance, often reminding him of the alliance's importance and the disappointment that would follow any further delay. Princess Serafina, for her part, remained composed and dignified, though she too seemed to sense Alexander's distance, even if she did not yet know its cause. It was inevitable that their secret meetings would eventually be noticed. One evening, as Alexander and Eliza spoke quietly in the garden beneath a sky full of stars, a guard making his rounds caught sight of them and reported the encounter to the head housekeeper. By morning, the news had spread through the staff quarters like wildfire. Eliza was summoned to the housekeeper's office, where she was met with a stern warning. "You forget your place," the housekeeper said sharply. "A duke and a servant speaking alone at night is scandal enough to ruin both your reputation and your family's already fragile name. If this continues, you will be dismissed immediately, and no household in the region will take you in afterward." Eliza left the office shaken, her hands trembling as she returned to her duties. She understood the danger clearly. A scandal involving the Duke could destroy not only her position, but her mother's chance at proper care, and her family's last shred of dignity. That evening, she sought out Alexander, finding him alone in the library. "We cannot continue this," she said, her voice steady despite the ache behind her words. "It is not safe, not for me, and certainly not for you. You are meant to marry a princess and secure your family's future. I am a servant, whose presence beside you threatens everything you are meant to become." Alexander rose from his chair, his expression troubled. "Eliza, I never intended to put you at risk." "I know," she said softly, "but intentions do not change consequences." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander stepped closer, his voice quiet but resolute. "I have spent my entire life doing what was expected of me. I have never once asked myself what I actually wanted, because I believed wanting anything was a luxury I could not afford. But these past weeks with you have shown me something I cannot ignore." "Alexander," Eliza whispered, his name unfamiliar and intimate on her lips. "I am not asking you to risk everything blindly," he continued. "I am asking for time to make things right, properly, without hiding in corridors and gardens like something shameful. Trust me a little longer." Eliza searched his eyes, finding nothing but sincerity. Though fear still lingered in her chest, she nodded. The formal ball arranged to announce Alexander's engagement to Princess Serafina took place a week later. The hall glittered with candlelight, and nobility from both kingdoms gathered in anticipation of the long-awaited announcement. The Duchess stood proudly near the front, certain the evening would finally bring the resolution she had worked so tirelessly to secure. Alexander stood before the gathered crowd, Princess Serafina beside him, her expression composed though her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. The room fell silent as the king's herald prepared to announce the formal engagement. Before the herald could speak, Alexander raised his hand. "Before this announcement is made," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, "I must speak honestly, both to Princess Serafina and to everyone gathered here tonight." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The Duchess's smile faltered. "For years, I believed duty meant sacrificing my own heart for the good of this kingdom," Alexander continued. "I believed that love was a privilege reserved for those without responsibility. But I have come to understand that a true partnership, the kind capable of leading a kingdom with honesty and strength, cannot be built solely on political convenience. It must be built on genuine understanding and respect. He turned toward Princess Serafina, who watched him with an expression more curious than offended. Princess Serafina, you are intelligent, gracious, and deserving of a partner who chooses you not out of obligation, but out of genuine devotion. I do not believe I am that man, and I believe deep down you may feel the same. To the astonishment of the room, Serafina did not appear devastated. Instead, a faint, knowing smile crossed her lips. You are not entirely wrong, Duke Alexander, she said quietly, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. There are matters of my own heart I have not yet been brave enough to voice. Whispers spread rapidly through the hall as Alexander turned to face the crowd once more. There is someone whose quiet strength and honesty have shown me more about true partnership than any title or political arrangement ever could. I do not ask for your immediate approval, only your understanding. He extended his hand toward the edge of the hall, where Eliza stood near the servants' entrance, her tray forgotten at her side, her eyes wide with disbelief. The room turned as one to look at her. For a moment, the silence was unbearable. Then, slowly, Eliza stepped forward, her chin lifted, despite the trembling in her hands. She crossed the hall under the weight of dozens of astonished stares until she reached Alexander's side. "Are you certain of this?" she whispered, just for him to hear. "More certain than I have been of anything in my life," Alexander replied. The following weeks brought significant turmoil. The Duchess, furious and humiliated, refused to speak with Alexander for several days, convinced he had thrown away the kingdom's future for a passing infatuation. Court gossip spread rapidly, and many nobles openly questioned Alexander's judgment. However, an unexpected turn of events soon shifted public opinion. Princess Serafina, rather than nursing resentment, revealed to her own family that she had long harbored feelings for a foreign duke from a distant province, someone she had been secretly corresponding with for over a year. Freed from the pressure of her arranged engagement, she pursued that relationship openly, and within months, the two kingdoms negotiated a separate trade agreement that satisfied both sides without requiring a marriage alliance at all. As for Eliza, the path forward was not without difficulty. The Duchess remained skeptical for some time, questioning whether a former servant could truly understand the responsibilities of managing a great household. But Eliza's quiet competence soon proved itself beyond doubt. When a crisis struck during the autumn harvest festival, a sudden storm threatening to ruin the outdoor celebrations, attended by dignitaries from across the region, it was Eliza who calmly organized the staff, redirected the event indoors within hours, and ensured not a single guest noticed the disruption. The Duchess, watching from a distance, saw for the first time not a servant playing at nobility, but a woman with genuine strength and capability. From that day forward, the Duchess's resistance softened. She began including Eliza in household discussions, testing her judgment on matters both small and significant, and found herself consistently impressed by the young woman's wisdom and grace. Alexander, for his part, never wavered in his decision. He insisted that Eliza's worth be recognized not through inherited privilege, but through her own character and ability, a stance that earned him both criticism and quiet admiration throughout the kingdom. Months later, the manor once again filled with candlelight and music, though this time for a far different occasion. Alexander and Eliza stood together before family, friends, and an unusual mixture of nobility and household staff, all gathered to witness their wedding. It was, by every account, an unconventional celebration. Former kitchen workers stood alongside dukes and earls, sharing laughter and conversation that crossed boundaries rarely broken in their world. The Duchess, who had once fought so fiercely against this very union, stood near the front with tears in her eyes, finally at peace with a future she had never imagined, but had come to embrace fully. As Alexander took Eliza's hand before the gathered crowd, he thought back to that first evening in the kitchen corridor, the soft humming that had drawn him through an open door and changed the course of his entire life. "I once believed my future was already written," he said quietly to her, away from the ears of their guests. "I am grateful every day that you taught me otherwise." Eliza smiled, her eyes bright with quiet joy. "Perhaps it was written all along, Alexander, just not in the way anyone expected." And so, in a kingdom where duty had always outweighed desire, and status had always determined worth, a duke and a tea-serving girl proved that genuine connection could overcome even the most rigid expectations, reshaping not only their own futures, but the understanding of everyone who witnessed their story unfold.